So I've returned to Bishopsgate to talk about the murder of Marie Jeanette Kelly, which took place not very far from here. And in Bishopsgate we're very close to Liverpool Street Station. So the murder of Marie Kelly was the worst of all the murders ever committed by this man we call Jack the Ripper. It was even worse than the murder of Catherine Eddowes, which took place on the 30th of September. This murder took place on the 9th of November, so there was a whole month of October in which people were dreadfully anticipating the possibility of a murder at one of the weekends or possibly at the end of October. Nothing happened, but everybody was on tenterhooks. So what I'm doing now is making my way from here, from Bishopsgate, towards the scene of the murder. Let me just switch so you can see for yourself now that what I'm doing is heading off towards what used to be the site of Dorset Street and Miller's Court, and to get there we have to go through part of old Victorian London that really hasn't changed essentially since Jack the Ripper's days. This street is no broader than it was in 1888, and the houses round here are houses that he would have recognised. The only thing that really would have surprised him is the amount of electric light. They didn't have electric light, certainly not to this extent in London in 1888. They didn't really have electric light and street lighting until the beginning of the 20th century. All they would have had is gas lighting. They may have had one gas lamp on the corner here, and that's it. Anyway, what we've now done is come down to a place called Sandys Row. And we've been here before. You can see this on the little video I did about the alleyways of old Spitalfields. You can go back and have a look at that if you want. But what I'd like to do is go a little bit further ahead now, through Artillery Passage, to make my way down to what is now the London Fruit and Wool Exchange, which stands on the site of what used to be Dorset Street and Miller's Court. So, all right. So I'm just going forward. It's all very smart around here. If you look at these shops, this was a slum, can you imagine it? And now it's a very smart and very chic place to come out. Well, of course, that's true of the area as a whole. Anyway, Artillery Passage, named after the fact that this was a place where the Honourable Artillery Company used to perform its exercises. Now, this is going back into the times of Henry V. A little way over here, I just want to point out to you Gun Street. I won't go down Gun Street, but I'll show you. Gun Street is on the corner. Gun Street, there was a common lodging house there, which was the home of Alice Mackenzie. And I'll talk a bit about her a bit later on, probably not in this video. But for the time being, I'll take us around here. And we'll go forward so that you can see me again. And as we do this now, you can have a look at the London Fruit and Wool Exchange. This modern building. London is quite an extraordinary amalgam of ancient and modern buildings, and this is one of the modern ones. It went up in 2019, and as I say, it's now completely obliterated Dorset Street and Miller's Court. To find Dorset Street now, you would have to look across the street, and you can see that there are two very large black double doors with a little red lamp. That marks out where Dorset Street used to be. Dorset Street was laid out in the late 1600s, and it was by Jack the Ripper's time, it's become a house which was called the worst street in London. That's because it was so full of common lodging houses. These were the places where the poor people used to live, and it was actually the home of Annie Chapman, our victim in Hanbury Street as well. Anyway, to find Dorset Street, find Miller's Court, you'd have to go up on the left-hand side towards Commercial Street. You only go about 3/4 of the way till you came to two houses which had been knocked together in the 1840s by a man called Miller, who was the owner of the property, and the idea was that he could build in what had once been the garden. There were two sets of apartment blocks, 6 each facing each other. That's 3 above 3, and so that was a total of 12. And you reached it by going through a passageway that was only 3 feet broad and about 20 feet long. And when you went up there, you found there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 on the apartment blocks, and then Mary Kelly lived at number 13. That was once the back parlour of number 26 Dorset Street. So what I want to do now is to take you to the site, or at least as close as I possibly can, to the site of the murder of Mary Kelly. And say Mary Kelly is actually a lady of mystery. We don't know, well, put it this way, everything that we know about Mary Kelly, including her name, comes from the information given to us by her common law husband, a man called Joe Barnett. And it appears that actually Mary Kelly went by several different names, and Mary Kelly may have just been one of them that she chose, so it makes it very difficult for investigators to confirm information. No, it's not an uncommon name, either Mary or Kelly, and so there must have been many people with that name, even Marie Jeanette Kelly, which is a nightmare for those people who are trying to do research. Okay, but what we'll do now is head round here. We'll go into the courtyard of this modern building, and what I will do is I will take you to the space and point out where I think, and I've measured this quite carefully, the space where I believe Mary Kelly lived and died. So we're just making our way through here. You can see it's Christmas time. That's Christmas 2024. Today is Friday the 3rd of January, and it's quite bright, and although it's cold, it's still dry. Now then, just down here, you see it's a super modern building with all the modern facilities. Wow. And just a look, as we stand in front of these great glass plates, a little way ahead of us, you can see there are some lifts, and you can see my reflection possibly in the glass. You can see there are 3 lifts or elevators. Now, what you need to focus on is the elevators over on the right-hand side towards me. They are D and E, and that is where I reckon the home of Mary Kelly was. She lived in a single room, which was 10 feet by 12. There was a single bed, a bedside table. As you went in, you opened the door. The bed would be on the right-hand side. There would be a larger table, 2 larger chairs, a fireplace, and then 2 windows that looked out into the drab little court where you could get some water from a tap. And Miller's Court was occupied by about 20 residents in total, they reckon, and they shared 3 open toilets. So that's what life was like in those days. Okay, so let's let's make our way from here. That's just to show you where it is. And I'll take you now back from here because I want to talk at greater length about Mary Kelly, who she was and what we know about her, which, as I say, is very little. It all came from the inquest. And much of the evidence that was given at the inquest was contradictory. There were people who gave evidence that suggested that Mary Kelly was alive and well at about 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning on the morning of a murder. We're looking now towards number 8 White's Row, and that was the home of Annie Millward, and Annie Millward was attacked there by a man in February of 1888. She was attacked in the lower abdomen and on the legs, and she was then taken to the infirmary, and she recovered from her wounds, but she died somewhat later. They say that the attack had nothing to do with her death. Well, I don't know. But anyway, I'm just pointing that out to you because it actually becomes relevant a bit later on, and I'll explain why. Okay, so let me switch around. Talk about Mary Kelly. Mary Kelly was, if we are to take the testimony of Joe Barnett at face value, Mary Kelly was born in Limerick in Ireland, and that would have been about 1863. We don't know exactly how old she was. She was in her mid-20s when she died, so we sort of worked backwards from there. As a very young girl, her father moved to Wales to take up a job in an ironworks. And so she lived in Wales and grew up in Wales, and she spoke Welsh fluently. And at the age of 16, she married a man called Davis. I don't think we know his first name, but we know his last name was Davis, so she was Mrs. Davis when she was 16 years old. Now, she was only Mrs. Davis for a very little while until her husband died, rather tragically, in a mining accident, which was a common hazard in those days. And so Mary Kelly then made her way down to the port of Cardiff in South Wales, where she was taken in by her cousin. And it was her cousin who introduced her to prostitution, so she was starting to make a living for herself in the port of Cardiff. She was an ambitious girl. She didn't want to stay in Cardiff for the rest of her life. She sought to come up to London, so that's exactly what she did. She came to London and she got herself an appointment in a very high-class house of disrepute in Knightsbridge, of all places. So she must have been a very pretty and attractive young girl. That's what all the reports that we have of her. She was very quickly taken up by a very wealthy client who took her to Paris. And so she was in Paris for a while. She didn't really like Paris, but it was when she was in Paris she started calling herself Marie Jeanette Kelly, and that is the name by which she's known on her tombstone. Anyway, she escaped from her client. She came back to London. She took up eventually with another man called Joe Barnett, whom I've just mentioned. He was a fishing porter at Billingsgate Market. And the pair met on Good Friday, that's April the 8th, 1887, at a place called Cooley's Lodging House in Thrall Street. And they arranged to live together, and they settled in various locations, and around about January of 1888 they came to live in Miller's Court. They paid £4 and sixpence a week rent. That's 54 pence in what we call the old money. It was a step up from the doss houses. At least you had some privacy and you could come and go when you liked. It wasn't very much of a step up, but it was better. And for a while things were going well for the couple, and they may even have been planning to get married. But the problem was that in August of 1888, Joe Barnett lost his job, and that caused financial problems for the couple. Joe could only find occasional jobs here and there, and so the rent went into arrears and started mounting. And Marie Kelly started talking about going back and doing the only job that she really knew how, which was prostitution on the streets. Joe Barnett objected to this vehemently, and then there were quarrels. And Joe Barnett was also highly resentful of the women that Mary Kelly used to bring back to number 13. Of course, but don't forget that she was the one who was now responsible for the rent, so she became the head of the household. Anyway, Mary Kelly used to allow her friends to come back and shelter in the flat, and that's not considering the fact that there was a homicidal maniac prowling the streets. That's something to take in consideration. Anyway, the point was there was a series of very heated rows, during the course of which one of the windows was smashed, and so they had to fill up the space with an old coat. Long and the short of it is that Joe Barnett moved out. He went off to live in another flat in Bishopsgate, where we've just come from, actually. And Mary Kelly was left then all to her own devices by herself. Actually, they remained on good terms, and Joe Barnett used to come back and he used to give him, if he had money, he would be able to give whatever money he was able to afford. But by the beginning of November, things were getting dire, because the rent was now mounting up. The arrears were 29 shillings, and that meant that Mary Kelly had a lot of work to do, and had to find many clients just to keep her head above water. So the events of Thursday the 8th of November and the morning of the 9th, these have to be reconstructed from the witness testimony given at the inquest, and as I say, many of the witnesses gave completely contradictory testimony. Some said that Mary Kelly had been seen beforehand. But there were two witnesses independently of each other, both of whom said that they were residents of Miller's Court, and both stated that they had been woken up at 4 o'clock in the morning by the sound of a woman's voice calling out murder. So that must have been Mary Kelly, and the other evidence we can only assume actually belongs to some recollection of something that happened on another day. Anyway, what had happened was that Mary Kelly went out on the early evening of Thursday the 8th. She went to the nearby 10 Bells pub to look for clients, and she actually didn't find a client. She found Lizzie Albrook and brought back Lizzie Albrook to Miller's Court. Then this would be around about 7:30. Joe Barnett arrived and Lizzie Albrook left. She actually left a large bundle of clothes. She worked as a washerwoman, so she left those in the flat. Joe Barnett had no money, so he didn't really want to stop very long, other than just to put his head round the door and just see that Mary Kelly was okay. So he left around about 8 o'clock, at the very latest I would think, perhaps a bit before, and then Mary Kelly set out and started to trawl the various pubs around here, and there were many of them, to look for clients. She must have had a fish and chip meal around about 10 o'clock in the evening, so that may have been bought for her, or she may have paid for herself. She was seen at 11:45, quarter to midnight, entering her room in the company of another man. She was drunk. Well, I think they were both drunk, actually. He was described as being in his mid-30s, with a blotchy face and a carroty moustache. He was rather shabbily dressed, with a long overcoat and a billycock, or what we now call a bowler hat. I think they call it a derby hat in America. And he was carrying what appeared to be a pail of beer. I don't know what that was for, but anyway, that's what the witness said. Mary Kelly then spent the next hour singing, and she was heard to sing "A Violet I Plucked from My Mother's Grave." She carried on like that, singing various songs, I suppose, for a while. Her landlord, John McCarthy, heard her doing this at 1 o'clock in the morning. Anyway, it gave Mary enough time to go out and find another customer, and she may have picked up a man in Commercial Street, which is I'll take you to in a little while, and then taking them back into a room shortly after 2 in the morning. And the description of this man was given by another witness who actually didn't appear at the inquest. And he said he was a man of dark complexion with a heavy moustache. The moustache was turned up at the ends. He had bushy eyebrows. From about 3 in the morning, it started to rain very, very heavily. And then it was at 4 in the morning that, as I say, these two witnesses, quite independently of each other, heard somebody call out murder, a woman's voice calling out murder, but they thought it was such a normal thing to hear in this area, so they took no notice and just rolled over and went back to sleep. So the point was that the murderer, we'll call him Jack the Ripper since we don't know what his real name was, had about an hour to work on this job in total privacy. And that meant that he was able to completely fulfill his fantasies and do a much more thorough job than he'd ever done on any of the other victims. He found the clothes that had been left by Lizzie Albrook, and he put those on the fire to give him a nice blaze so that he had plenty of light to work with. And then he took out his knife. He did the usual thing, that is to say, he strangled Mary Kelly before cutting her throat, and then he went on to commit other abominations on the corpse, and that was to really cut it open, pull out all the all the sort of really nasty stuff. And then he must have left. Somebody said in Miller's Court they heard somebody walking along the paving stones at 4:45, so that must have been the murder. And then after this, he just vanished, and that's just finishes. So 10:45. That's in the morning. John McCarthy, who was the landlord of Miller's Court, sent his man, a man called Bowyer, to go and see if he could sort of pick up any rent. So Bowyer went along and knocked on the door. Of course, there was no answer. Went round, saw that the window had been broken and it were being patched up with a piece of cloth or old coat. Pushed that aside. And then what he saw ahead of him, he was so shocked and appalled, he went straight back to report to his boss, John McCarthy. John McCarthy came rushing to see what was wrong, and he peered through the window into the room, and he stated later that the sight I saw, I cannot drive away from my mind. It looked more like the work of a devil than a man. I had heard a great deal about the Whitechapel murders, but I declare to God that I never expected to see such a sight as this. Bowyer was then sent to fetch the police from the local police station. They attempted to enter the room, but they were unable to do so because the door was locked. It was actually on an automatic lock, so if you closed it, it would lock the moment the door came to. And you needed a key to open it, and they'd lost the key, or at least Mary Kelly said that she'd lost the key. She used to get inside by putting a hand through the broken window, but they didn't know this, so that was the situation. Anyway, they went to get the police from the police station. They attempted to enter the room, they couldn't do so. The police went off to notify senior officials at Scotland Yard, and then Dr. Bagster Phillips and the police surgeon, Dr. Thomas Bond, came down. At length, John McCarthy broke down the door with an axe so that the police and the doctors could go inside. It was Dr. Thomas Bond who performed the autopsy, and he said that the whole surface of the abdomen and thighs was removed and the abdominal cavity emptied of its viscera. The breasts were cut off and the arms mutilated by several jagged wounds, and the face hacked beyond recognition of the features. The tissues of the neck were severed all down to the bone. The face was gashed in all directions, the nose, the cheeks, the eyebrows and ears being partly removed. The lips were blanched and cut off by several incisions, running obliquely down the chin, and there were numerous cuts extending irregularly across all the features. Dr. Bond reckoned that the murder took place about 2 in the morning. He said the murderer, in his opinion, had no scientific or anatomical knowledge and didn't even possess the technical knowledge that would be required of a butcher. or a horse slaughterer. He went on to create what he called, very interesting, a profile of the man who did this job. He said the murderer in external appearance, this was according to his own extensive experience of dealing with murders, he would have been quite likely to be a quiet and inoffensive looking man, probably middle-aged and neatly and respectably dressed. He'd also be solitary and eccentric in his habits. He's also most likely to be a man without a regular occupation, but with some small income or pension. He's probably living among persons who have some knowledge of his character and habits and have grounds for suspicion that he's not in his right mind at times. So, this was the last of the canonical murders. The inquest was held on the following Monday, and they reached a verdict within a few hours, that is to say, death by person or persons unknown. And so this is really where all the facts of the matter come to an end, and this is where all the speculations begin. And so far we have about something like 350 names have come forward, and that number increases every year. Among the favourite suspects are, firstly, a man called Aaron Kosminski. He was a 28-year-old Polish Jew who lived not very far from the Church of St. Mary in Whitechapel, and he was often seen wandering through the streets eating out of the gutters. It was said that he had a very strong hatred of women generally and became very violent when he was approached. Now, there must have been many people in Scotland Yard who thought him was the murderer, because what they did is they kept him under strict surveillance for the following 2 years, and although they never found a single shred of evidence to connect him with this murder, they found more than enough evidence to have him put away in a psychiatric institution. So that's what happened to him. He ended up in a place called Londonstone in Hertfordshire, and he died there in 1919. There's also another name, that is the name of a man called Severin Klosowski, who, by the way, was also Polish. He worked as a barber, and he lived in Cable Street, which is near the Tower of London. Now, the interesting thing, he was hanged in 1903 when he was using the name George Chapman. And he was hanged for the murder of his wife. In fact, he'd married 3 wives in quick succession, and he'd poisoned them all. Now, that's a completely different method of operation from the one that we're used to. But occasionally, serial murderers do change their method of operation. So, the other name, which is very popular at the present moment, is a man called Charles Lechmere. He was the man who first discovered the body of Mary Ann Nichols in the early morning of the 31st of August. And when he went to report this matter to the police, he gave the name Charles Cross. He was perfectly entitled to do this because his father died. His father's name was Lechmere, and his father died, and his mother remarried, and another man called Cross was actually his stepfather. Why he chose another man called Cross was his stepfather. Why he chose to use that name, we don't know, but the reason why his very often is singled out for being the murderer is that simply he walked through the murder district every morning in order to get to work. I don't buy this myself. I'm still thinking about it. There's a man called Ed Stowe who makes a very persuasive series of videos about Lechmere, which I can highly recommend, and I've learned a great deal from Ed Stowe, not least of which is how to make professional videos, which I still have to work on. But anyway, the identity of Jack the Ripper remains a mystery to this day, and probably carry on doing so. You have to use the FBI serial killer profile. We can say the murderer himself, whoever he was probably born somewhere around about 1858. Sorry, I'm just getting up. 1858, let's say give or take a few years. He'd be a man rather than a woman. I think I've made that point before, that most serial killers are men, and the female serial killers, on the whole, don't use physical violence, and certainly not to the extreme extent that Jack the Ripper used. He was a member of the working class. He was a very ordinary sort of man. As I say, Bond didn't seem to think that he was in any way a horse slaughterer. He may have had acquired some technique. He may not have been a horse slaughterer at the time of the murder, but he may have worked once upon a time in that occupation. Anyway, as I say, new names are going to be coming up all the time, and some of the names are going to be really quite fantastic. What we can say is that whatever names people come up with, it will not be Winston Churchill, because Winston Churchill was only 14 when the murders took place. He will not be Florence Nightingale. She was, 69? A woman, and that puts her outside the range. And no doubt they'll pick up other eminent Victorians, possibly even somebody like Charles Dickens. Well, that's absurd, we know that, because Charles Dickens died in 1870. All sorts of ideas will no doubt carry on. Don't forget that Jack the Ripper, with this series of murders, there was a considerable amount of anti-Semitism, a lot of hostility directed towards the local Jewish population. And that suggests to me that if he were Jewish and he'd approached one of these ladies, they would have run a mile. I think, and I'll come to really the point why I'm doing this whole series of videos, and I'm now going to switch around and show this neighbourhood, just to show you White's Row, and I'll show you again. This is White's Row, which runs parallel, or used to run parallel, with Dorset Street. Ahead of us is Commercial Street, and beyond Commercial Street you come to Fashion Street. Now we make our way up here. This is Commercial Street here. Fashion Street is on my immediate left-hand side. As we go up the next street along to the left-hand side, now called Lulworth Close. That used to be Flower and Dean Street, and then the next street along is Thrall Street. Now, what's interesting about this? Okay, well, as I said, White's Row here, you have Annie Millwood, and then in Gun Street you have Alice Mackenzie. In Dorset Street you have Annie Chapman, and you also have Marie Jeanette Kelly. Around here, Thrall Street, you have Mary Ann Nichols, and you also have Emma Smith. And then in George Yard Buildings, George Yard, now Gunthorpe Street, you have Martha Tabram. And in Flower and Dean Street, you have Catherine Eddowes, and you also have Liz Stride. So, what I find interesting is that all the victims lived within this neighbourhood. When this is going back to 1888, obviously. There's the church. And because they lived in the neighbourhood and they're all in the same age, more or less, and they're all in the same occupation, I think they'd have been able to recognise each other, at least across the street, even if they didn't know each other very well. And also, I think they would have recognised the man who murdered them. Again, they didn't have to have a very intimate knowledge of him. Again, somebody they've just recognised from across the street, somebody they would be able to see and assume that he would be perfectly safe, the sort of person they could quite comfortably go off with because he was one of their own tribe. And that's really where he scored. So there we have it, ladies and gentlemen. That is really where I come to, as far as I can go with the Jack the Ripper story. I will carry on as best I can, and I can't promise that I'm going to get the identity, but I think I have made some more practical ideas about the way forward. I'm working to explain what I'm not doing. I'm not just taking names, drawing them out of the air, and then trying to fit the facts around them. I'm finally going out and I'm looking for the facts that we know. We know where the victims died, and we also know where they lived. And what I find interesting is that the places where these victims lived are all clustered together, and I don't think that's a coincidence. And because they're all clustered together, I have an idea that this is also the place where I would start looking, put it that way. It's all a matter of probabilities, but if I were looking now for Jack the Ripper, this is the area I would look for him. And I would look for a man of about 30, in the working class, very ordinary man. And as I say, may have had some occupation in horse slaughtering at some time in his life. So I will leave it at that point, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you've enjoyed this. I'd call it enjoyment, but if you haven't enjoyed it, I just hope that you are better informed.